Today, Thomas and I will be covering poverty, specifically the impact of COVID-19 on global inequality. Before analysing the impact of COVID on poverty, some key notions to the topic must first be discussed. Namely, what is poverty? Poverty refers to a low standard of living, that is, being deprived of the basic necessities of life. Poverty can be further subdivided into absolute poverty and relative poverty. Absolute poverty is the more intuitive form of poverty, and it flows from the broad definition we've just given. Relative poverty is of more interest to economists, and this refers to income or wealth inequality within a society when comparing the top to the bottom. Whilst absolute poverty has more obvious negative connotations, it will later be shown that the relative poverty or economic inequality can be just as harmful to society. It's also important when considering inequality to separate income and wealth inequality. Put simply, wealth inequality refers to the difference in the total assets of members of society, whereas income equality refers to differences in yearly income. Economists often focus on income equality as it offers a more current picture of economic disparity, with wealth inequality often representing a longer build-up of economic disadvantage. The long-term effect of wealth inequality is most evident when considering global wealth inequality. Europe and America, with only 20% of the global population, hold 67% of the world's total wealth, compared to China, with 8% and India and Africa combined with only 2%, despite having comparable or even larger populations. This is likely reflective of how the Industrial Revolution and transitions into developed economies occurring earlier in Europe and America compared to the other nations, led to a build-up of infrastructure and business that provides a wealth advantage to these regions, which will take a greater time to build up. Income inequality is more current as it represents yearly cash flows and can thus predict later changes in wealth as certain groups take larger or smaller sections of the yearly income. When considering income distribution, we observe a similar pattern to that of wealth inequality. Further, this pattern has steadily increased since the 70s, indicated by the upward slope of the top 1% curve towards the right-hand side of the graph. Again, a staggering level of inequality is observed, with 35 to 65% of income taken by the top 1%, while the bottom 50% combined only take between 5 and 25% of the yearly income. Put more simply, in Australia, the top fifth of earners earn up to 7 times more than the bottom fifth, whereas in America it's an even higher level, with the top earners earning 8.5 times more than the bottom earners. Both these countries display relatively high levels of inequality compared to other OECD nations. With the widespread nature of economic inequality established, its impacts, specifically the negative ones, should be considered. Intrinsic impacts refer to the obvious moral argument against inequality. That is, it's ethically unfair for that level of disparity to exist. The hierarchical nature of income distribution in some nations can lead to anxiety as people are evaluated wholly by their economic standing, leaving them feeling powerless and unrepresented by society. Interestingly, despite members throughout all levels of the economy in Australia observing the prevalence and impacts of inequality, it still persists in seemingly increasing levels. Perhaps then, the more measurable impacts of inequality should be considered. These are often referred to as instrumental effects. The most obvious instrumental impacts of inequality is decreased social mobility and the potential for the elite class to control policy and decrease competition in private markets. More objectively, research would suggest that inequality forms a positive linear relationship with a wide range of social outcomes. As seen on the graph, America, one of, if not the most economically separated societies, has the highest levels of obesity, imprisonment, teenage pregnancy, drug addiction, education issues, and more. With the wide-ranging negative impacts of inequality on society here displayed, it should be the objective of government policy to reduce all forms of poverty and inequality wherever possible. COVID-19 is a global issue with a high potential to impact on inequality. Today we'll be considering the policy response of America and Australia in addressing the economic fallout from lockdowns associated with the pandemic. Starting with America, the high levels of income and wealth inequality prior to COVID must first be considered. Following a sharp upwards trend, income inequality is at its maximum since the Great Depression, with the top 1% earning around 18% of the national income, while the bottom combined 50% earn only 13 to 14%. A similar trend exists in America's wealth inequality, with the top 1% owning just under 35% of the national wealth, compared to just 28% held by the combined bottom 50%. Unfortunately, the impact of the pandemic was unequal on American society and further accentuated its inequality. Up to 44 million jobs were lost, raising the unemployment rate to a massive 15% between April and June. The job loss and economic hardship affected the lower end of society disproportionately. Specifically, women, elderly, the disabled, and migrant populations were hit worst. Conversely, the stock market saw a massive rise, with America's billionaires gaining another $637 billion in wealth. The combined effect of the pandemic thus accentuated already high levels of economic disparity in America. The USA's policy to combat economic impacts of COVID-19 manifests primarily in the US Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, otherwise known as CARES. Worth an estimated $2.2 trillion, this policy encompasses the economic impact payments or stimulus checks of $1,200 made to individuals, a pay protection program, which involves forgivable loans to small businesses to incentivize them to keep staff on payroll despite lockdowns, and an extension to the unemployment benefits program, which is an increase in the availability of unemployment benefits to Americans. In combination, the Federal Reserve Bank engaged in quantitative easing, purchasing at least $700 billion in government and mortgage-related securities, and they also lowered the interest rate to 0 to stimulate further spending. But how effective was the policy? The key question in evaluating the success of CARES within the framework of inequality is how it addresses absolute and relative poverty. Specifically then, how disadvantaged members of society were supported. Unfortunately, the success of the policy is impeded by administrative issues. The key support being provided to low-income individuals were increased access to unemployment and the economic impact payments. However, only 10% of Americans are currently able to receive unemployment, and 42% of the population are still waiting on their stimulus check. Inability to provide accurate documentation by individuals and a lack of existing national infrastructure are noted as reasons for this issue. Compared to Australia's effective use of existing Centrelink payments to facilitate the JobKeeper, this must be seen as a failure by the American government to provide to those in need. The failure of the US government to provide financial aid to low-income Americans in a timely manner has impeded their success in preventing both relative and absolute poverty. The monthly poverty rate increased from 15 to 16.7% from February to September 2020, even after taking the CARES Act's income transfers into account. Increases in monthly poverty rates have been particularly acute for Black and Hispanic individuals, as well as for children. This number is also set to increase as the unemployment benefits are reduced in the coming months. Evidently, absolute poverty has not been effectively addressed by the CARES policy, but perhaps this represents deep-seated issues in the American economy rather than a direct failure of the CARES Act. Furthermore, when the struggles of low-income Americans are compared to the increase in top earners' wealth, who still receive support from CARES, it can be seen that relative poverty, as well as absolute poverty, has increased due to the pandemic, despite government intervention attempts.
Australia's impact and response to COVID-19. Pre-COVID inequality. Australia's level of income inequality pre-COVID displayed apparent discrepancies in the distribution of income, with those in the highest 20% of national income receiving 7 times the amount of those in the lowest 20%. On top of this, wealth inequality displays the apparent gap, with those in the lower fifth of wealth receiving a surprising 1%. As opposed to the top 20% receiving 64% of total wealth distribution. Income inequality in Australia reached its climax in 2008 due to the GFC. The gradual plateau in inequality pre-COVID was still the highest recorded level of inequality experienced by Australia between the 1980s and 2006. The impact of COVID. With COVID-19 reaching its peak in 2020, businesses struggled to keep open due to lower turnover, lockdowns caused many businesses to close, and the economy was heavily affected. The first impact of this was on the level of unemployment and hours worked for those in affected industries. Employment was down 6%, and hours worked were down 10%. Unemployment rose to 7.2% in June 2020 and had an expected increase of 10% come December. The impact of such is shown through the increased Gini coefficient of 0.34, which hasn't been as high since the impact of GFC in 2008. Those significantly affected included the arts, hospitality and recreation industries, lower paid workers, women, younger workers and low-trained employees. Australia's response to COVID-19. In response to the pandemic, the Australian government used a balanced micro and macroeconomic approach. This consisted of increased expenditure towards an economic support package worth $259 billion as of July 2nd, 2020. This was to assist smaller businesses with lower turnover and accompany affected communities, while continuing the flow of funds throughout the Australian economy. Alongside this, the RBA lowered the cash rate to 0.25% and later further to 0.1%. This was met with the introduction of a term fund facility to lower borrowing costs for the household and business sectors. The Australian government also introduced two comprehensive schemes to assist with the effect long-term lockdowns and lower turnover had on businesses. This consisted of an estimated expenditure of $84 billion between March and September 2020. The scheme, known as the JobKeeper payment, was introduced on the 31st of March 2020 and allowed businesses with decreased turnover to stay running by contributing $750 per week for employee wages regardless of the previous income or hours worked. This payment was given to an employer to pay employee wages, however later decreased to $600 a week for those working 20 hours or more and $375 for those below the 20-hour threshold. This scheme was later ended on the 28th of March 2021. The second scheme introduced was the COVID supplement payment. This payment was tailored to those on various welfare payments such as JobSeeker, youth allowance, and parenting payments. Unlike JobKeeper, this scheme was means tested, meaning those earning a single income of less than $27,000 a year and those with a parted income of less than $107,000 a year are eligible. This payment included $270 on top of already received payments, which was later decreased to $125 a week and ended in late March 2021. How effective was the policy? The policy initiatives made by the Australian government have counteracted the negative effects COVID has had on inequality. Those in the lower portion of income distribution received wage increases as a result, boosting consumption and spending, keeping those in jobs, as shown through the figure. Without these policy changes, the estimated level of poverty in Australia would have risen from 3,018,000 to 5,772,000. As a result of these initiatives, poverty was reduced by 13%, partly due to JobKeeper and COVID supplement payments. However, with the recent removal of these two schemes, poverty is expected to rise to 3,489,000. While these schemes benefited Australians greatly, they do exclude minority groups such as temporary visa holders and those who have worked as a casual employee for less than a year.
Whilst both countries aim to combat poverty caused by COVID-19, in each case minority groups were left struggling. Whilst Australia succeeded over America in reducing the direct effects of the pandemic through more efficiently implemented policy, each nation struggles to reduce levels of relative poverty regardless of global issues.